The sound reached Jeremiah Blackwood before the sight, a wet, methodical gnawing that made his empty stomach clench with revulsion. He found his youngest daughter, Temperance, huddled in the corner of their cramped tenement room, her small fingers pressed between her teeth, blood seeping from the ragged stumps where her fingernails had once been. "Temperance," he whispered, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. The gas had been shut off 3 days ago, along with their meager heat, leaving the Blackwood family to shiver in their fourth-floor prison above Hester Street. The 8-year-old girl looked up at him with hollow eyes that seemed too large for her gaunt face. Her lips were stained crimson, and she made no move to remove her fingers from her mouth. Instead, she bit down harder, and Jeremiah heard the sickening crunch of bone against tooth. "Papa," she said around her bleeding digits. "They taste like copper pennies." The pounding at their door resumed with renewed violence, 3 sharp raps that shook the rotting wooden frame. Jeremiah's creditors had been circling like vultures for weeks, their demands growing more insistent as winter tightened its grip. On the Lower East Side, through the paper-thin walls, he could hear the Kowalski family arguing in Polish, their voices mixing with the ever-present sound of crying babies and hacking coughs that echoed through the tenement's diseased corridors. Constance sat motionless at their rickety table, staring at a bowl of water that had frozen solid hours ago. She hadn't spoken since Tuesday, not since they'd discovered their last few coins had mysteriously vanished from beneath the loose floorboard. Her once auburn hair hung in greasy strings around her face, and her wedding dress, the only garment she owned that wasn't torn beyond repair, had taken on the sickly yellow hue of old parchment. The smell of decay permeated everything: rotting wood, spoiled food from apartments below, and something else, something organic and wrong that seemed to seep from the building's very bones. Jeremiah had noticed it growing stronger each day, as if the tenement itself was slowly dying alongside its inhabitants. "Mama," Temperance called softly, but Constance didn't turn. The woman's shoulders rose and fell with mechanical precision, each breath visible in the Arctic air of their home. Jeremiah approached his daughter, his joints protesting with each step. When had he become so old? At 34, he moved like a man twice his age, his body consuming itself from the inside out. He knelt beside Temperance and gently took her wrists, trying to pull her hands from her mouth. "Stop this, child. You'll hurt yourself." "I'm already hurt, Papa." Her voice was eerily calm, adult-like in its resignation. "Everything hurts when you're this hungry, but this helps." She bit down again, harder this time, and Jeremiah watched in horror as she chewed thoughtfully, as if savoring the taste of her own flesh. The sound of her teeth grinding against bone echoed in the silence, punctuated only by the relentless pounding at their door and the whistle of wind through the cracked windows. Outside, the gas lamps of Hester Street cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow-covered cobblestones. The year 1881 had arrived with promises of prosperity for some, but for the Blackwood family, it had brought only a deeper descent into the kind of poverty that ate away at both body and soul. Jeremiah looked at his wife's motionless form, then back at his daughter's blood-stained smile, and felt something cold settle in his chest, colder even than the winter air that invaded their lungs with each breath. The hunger was beginning to change them all. The blizzard of January 15th had buried the Lower East Side beneath 3 feet of snow, turning the already treacherous streets into impassable tunnels of ice and misery. Jeremiah pulled his threadbare coat tighter as he trudged through the frozen wasteland that had once been Orchard Street, his breath forming crystalline clouds that hung in the air like the ghosts of better times. For 6 days now, he had made this same pilgrimage, from factory to dock to construction site, searching for any work that might put food in his family's mouths. The foreman barely glanced at him anymore. His gaunt frame and hollow cheeks marked him as one of the desperate, and desperate men were dangerous in ways that made employers uncomfortable. They wanted workers, not walking skeletons who might collapse at their stations. The Hartwell Textile mill on Delancey Street had been his last hope. The Irish foreman, Murphy, had looked him up and down with eyes that held no mercy. "You're too thin, Blackwood. Can't have you fainting into the machinery. Bad for business," Jeremiah had begged, offering to work for half wages, but Murphy had already turned away, shouting orders at a group of younger, stronger men who still had meat on their bones. Now, as evening shadows stretched across the snow-covered tenements, Jeremiah climbed the creaking stairs to his family's apartment with empty hands and a heart full of dread. The smell hit him first. That same sickly sweet odor of decay, but stronger now, as if something had died within their walls. He found Thaddeus waiting by the door, his 16-year-old son's face bearing new lines that spoke of experiences no child should endure. The boy had been gone for 2 days, vanishing without explanation into the maze of 5 points, and Jeremiah had feared the worst. "Where have you been?" Jeremiah whispered, not wanting to wake Constance, who still sat motionless at the table, like a statue carved from grief. Thaddeus rolled up his sleeves, revealing his forearms. Jeremiah's breath caught in his throat. Deep, crescent-shaped wounds covered the boy's pale skin. Bite marks that were too large to be from any rat, too deliberate to be accidental. "The Jameson factory," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying a disturbing note of pride. "They pay good money for night work. Real good money." "What kind of work leaves marks like these?" Thaddeus's smile was wrong, too wide, too knowing for a boy. "His age." "The rats, Papa. Big as cats, some of them. They get hungry too, you know. But they pay me $5 for every night I spend in the basement. $5 whole. He pulled a handful of crumpled bills from his pocket, more money than the family had seen in months. But Jeremiah couldn't take his eyes off those wounds, the way they seemed to glisten in the dim light filtering through their frost-covered window. From the corner, Temperance giggled, a sound like breaking glass. She had moved to the window and was pressing her face against the ice, her breath melting small circles in the frost. But it wasn't her breath that caught Jeremiah's attention. It was the way she was methodically biting the inside of her cheek, her jaw working with the same mechanical precision she'd shown with her fingernails. "Mama's been cooking," she announced without turning around. "All day, stirring and stirring. But she won't tell me what's in the pot." Jeremiah turned toward the small cooking area and saw Constance standing over their lone pot, ladling thin broth into wooden bowls. Steam rose from the liquid, carrying a scent that was both familiar and utterly foreign. As she lifted the ladle, he caught sight of long strands floating in the broth, hair the same auburn color as his wife's, though hers had grown noticeably thinner in recent days. "Constance," he called softly, but she didn't respond. She continued, her stirring, her movements hypnotic and precise, as if she were following some ancient recipe passed down through generations of the starving. The creditors had stopped pounding at their door. Even they, it seemed, had given up on collecting debts from the dead. But the silence felt worse somehow, as if the world outside had forgotten they existed, leaving them to disappear quietly into the growing darkness of their own making. Thaddeus counted his money again, the bills crackling like dry leaves. "Tomorrow night they want me back. Said they might have special work for me. Extra pay." His eyes gleamed with an hunger that had nothing to do with food, and Jeremiah realized with mounting horror that his family was beginning to find new ways to survive, ways that were changing them into something that could no longer be called human. Subscribe and comment below if you're enjoying this descent into darkness. Let me know what you think the Blackwood family will do next to survive. The truth came to Jeremiah in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror that cut deeper. With each revelation, he followed Thaddeus through the labyrinthine streets of 5 Points, keeping to the shadows as his son navigated the maze of brothels, gambling dens, and opium parlors that made up New York's most notorious slum. The February wind carried the stench of human refuse and something else, something metallic that made Jeremiah's empty stomach churn. Thaddeus stopped before a narrow alleyway between 2 crumbling brick buildings, where a sign hung crookedly above a basement entrance. Kerner's. Specialty meats, exotic fare for discerning palates. The German butcher who emerged from the shadows was a massive man with arms like tree trunks and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural hunger. "Ah, young Blackwood," Kerner said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying the warmth of a father. greeting his favorite son. Right on time. My customers, they are most eager for tonight's offering. Jeremiah watched in mounting horror as his son rolled up his sleeves with practiced ease, revealing fresh wounds alongside the healing scars from previous visits. Kerner produced a gleaming knife from his apron, not the crude butcher's blade Jeremiah had expected, but something surgical in its precision. The upper arm today, I think, Kerner mused, running his finger along Thaddeus's bicep. Nice and tender. My gentleman from Gramercy Park, he pays extra for the young meat. Thaddeus bit down on a leather strap as the blade made its first cut. The sound that escaped his lips was not quite a scream. It was something far worse, a sound that spoke of pleasure mixed with agony, of a boy who had learned to find satisfaction in his own mutilation. $10, Kerner said, wrapping the carved flesh in brown paper as if it were nothing more than a Sunday roast. Same time tomorrow? Yes, sir, Thaddeus gasped, binding his wound with strips of cloth. Maybe you could use more of me? I heal fast. Jeremiah fled then, his legs carrying him back through the frozen streets while his mind reeled with the impossibility of what he'd witnessed. But when he burst through the door of their tenement apartment, he found scenes that made Kerner's butcher shop seem like a child's tea party. Temperance sat cross-legged on the floor, her small hands working methodically as she peeled strips of skin from her arms with her fingernails. She had arranged the pieces in neat rows, like a child organizing her dolls, and was taking small, delicate bites from each strip as if sampling fine chocolates. It's better when it's fresh, Papa, she said without looking up. Once it gets cold, it tastes like pennies, but warm. Warm it tastes like when Mama used to make Sunday dinner. Her arms were a patchwork of raw wounds and healing scars, but she showed no sign of pain. Instead, her face held an expression of profound satisfaction, as if she had discovered some fundamental truth about survival that the rest of the world had yet to understand. Constance had abandoned all pretense. She sat at the table with a small paring knife, carefully cutting thin slices from her own thigh and adding them to the ever-present pot of broth. Each piece went in with a soft plop that echoed in the silence like a heartbeat. We don't need the outside world anymore, she said, speaking for the first time in days. Her voice was dreamlike, distant. We have everything we need right here. We are the meal and the family that shares it. We are complete. The apartment itself seemed to pulse with approval. The rotting walls appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting like the ribcage of some massive slumbering beast. The floorboards creaked not with age, but with what sounded almost like satisfaction, as if the building itself was feeding on the family's descent into self-cannibalism. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, watching his wife and daughter consume themselves with the methodical precision of devout worshippers performing a sacred ritual. His own stomach cramped with hunger, and for one terrible moment, he understood the logic of their actions. Why should they starve when they carried their own salvation in their flesh? His hand moved unconsciously to his forearm, fingers probing the thin skin that covered stringy muscle and bone. He was so hungry, hungrier than he had ever been in his life, and the smell rising from Constance's pot was actually quite appetizing, rich and meaty, with undertones of something indefinably familiar. Just a small piece, Temperance said, holding up a strip of her own skin. To see what it's like. To understand why we don't hurt anymore. Jeremiah's mouth watered against his will, and he realized with dawning horror that his family had found the perfect solution to their poverty. They would never go hungry again, because they were both the hunters and the prey, the meal and the diners trapped in an endless cycle that made a mockery of everything he had once believed about survival and human dignity. The hunger was no longer just in their stomachs, it lived in their souls now, transforming them into something that defied every natural law. Subscribe and comment below. Are you as disturbed as I am by the Blackwood family's solution to their poverty? Let me know your thoughts on this twisted tale of survival. Sunday arrived with no church bells to mark its passage. The Blackwood family had found their own cathedral in the suffocating darkness of their tenement apartment. Constance had spent the morning preparing what she called their communion, arranging the family's offerings on their lone wooden table with the reverence of a priest consecrating sacred elements. Thaddeus's contribution lay at the center, a portion of his left shoulder blade, carved with surgical precision and seasoned with salt he had somehow procured from Kerner's establishment. The meat was pale and marbled with thin veins of fat, looking disturbingly similar to the veal that had once graced better tables in better times. Temperance had provided what she termed the holy wine, a clay cup filled with her own blood, drawn from carefully opened veins in her wrists. She had learned to tie tourniquets, to open and close the wounds with expert timing, transforming her small body into a renewable source of sustenance. Her face glowed with an almost beatific expression as she presented her offering to the family altar. "It's sweeter when you're happy," she explained to Jeremiah with the earnestness of a child sharing a precious secret. "Fear makes it taste bitter, like when you bite your tongue too hard. But when you're grateful, when you understand the gift you're giving yourself, it tastes like communion wine." Constance had contributed the base of their feast, strips of flesh from her thighs braised in her own rendered fat, the skin crispy and glistening under the wavering light of their last candle. She had arranged it on their chipped china plates, the ones from her wedding dowry, treating the meal with the formality their desperate circumstances demanded. The apartment walls seemed to lean inward, as if the building itself was drawing closer to witness this unholy supper. The rotting timber creaked rhythmically, like breathing, and the gas pipes hummed with sounds that resembled whispered prayers in languages that predated human speech. The very air grew thick with anticipation, charged with the electricity of transgression. "Papa," Constance said, her voice carrying none of the madness that had consumed her words in recent days. Instead, she spoke with crystalline clarity, as if the act of preparing their feast had restored some fundamental part of her humanity, or replaced it with something else entirely. "You must partake. The family that feeds together stays together." Jeremiah stared at the grotesque banquet spread before him, his stomach cramped with a hunger that had moved beyond physical need into something spiritual, something that demanded satisfaction regardless of its source. The meat looked succulent, perfectly cooked, and the aroma rising from the plates was undeniably appetizing, rich and complex, with undertones that reminded him of his mother's Sunday roasts from decades past. "I can't," he whispered. But even as the words left his lips, his hand was reaching for the carving knife Constance had placed beside his plate. "You can," Thaddeus said, his voice hoarse from blood loss but filled with evangelical fervor. "We've discovered the truth, Papa. The secret that the rich have always known, that survival requires consumption, that the strong must feed on something. We've simply eliminated the middleman." With trembling hands, Jeremiah placed the knife against his left thigh, just above the knee where the muscle was thickest. The blade was sharp. Constance had honed it to razor perfection, and it sliced through skin and fat with surgical ease. The pain was immediate and intense, but beneath it lay something else. A profound sense of relief, as if he were finally participating in a sacrament that would absolve him of all his failures as a father and provider. The blood flowed freely, dripping onto the floor where it was immediately absorbed by the wooden boards, as if the building itself was drinking deeply of their sacrifice. Jeremiah carved away a piece of his own flesh, the motion becoming mechanical, ritualistic, as natural as breathing. He placed the meat on his plate beside the offerings of his family, then raised it to his lips with the solemnity of a penitent taking communion. The first bite was revelation, not just the taste, which was surprisingly tender and flavorful, but the profound sense of completion that flooded through him. He was no longer just consuming food. He was participating in the ancient cycle of life and death, of sacrifice and sustenance, of love expressed through the ultimate gift of self. The family ate in reverent silence, each bite bringing them closer together, binding them in a covenant written in blood and flesh. Outside their windows, the gaslight flickered through the February darkness, casting dancing shadows that seemed to celebrate their unholy communion. As they feasted, their wounds began to heal with supernatural speed, the torn flesh knitting itself back together, as if their bodies understood that this was not damage, but transformation. They were becoming something new, something that transcended the ordinary limitations of human existence. The tenement building settled around them with sounds of deep satisfaction, its ancient timbers creaking in approval. They had found the perfect solution to poverty, to hunger, to all the inequities that had driven them to this extremity. They were the meal and the diners, the sacrifice and the beneficiaries, locked in an eternal cycle that would sustain them forever, or damn them forever. In the darkness beyond their candlelight, something watched and waited, ancient and patient, feeding on more than flesh, feeding on souls that had willingly offered themselves to the hunger that lived in the spaces between. Desperation and madness. Subscribe and comment below if this twisted family feast has left you disturbed. What do you think will happen when their unholy communion becomes a permanent way of life? Time lost all meaning in the Blackwood apartment after the first communion. Days blended into nights in an endless cycle of feeding and healing, of carving and consuming, of wounds that closed as quickly as they were opened. Jeremiah could no longer remember when they had begun this ritual, or even what month it was. The calendar on their wall had stopped at February, its pages now stained with substances that had once been sacred only to their bodies. The regeneration was not natural. Each piece of flesh they carved away grew back within hours, but the new meat was different somehow, denser, richer, with a flavor that grew more intoxicating with each feast. Their bodies had become perfect farming instruments, cultivating themselves with the efficiency of a well-tended garden. But gardens, Jeremiah began to realize, belonged to gardeners. Temperance no longer looked like a child. Her face had taken on an ageless quality, her eyes holding depths that spoke of ancient wisdom and ancient hungers. She moved through their apartment with fluid grace, her small hands working constantly, cutting, preparing, seasoning pieces of herself with herbs that seemed to sprout from the very walls. "We're not alone anymore, Papa," she whispered one evening, as she arranged strips of her arm meat into elegant patterns on their dining table. "Can you feel them watching? The others who came before?" Jeremiah could feel them, shadows that moved independently of candlelight, whispers that came from voices that had no bodies, the constant sensation of being observed by eyes that existed in dimensions beyond human sight. The tenement building had become a vessel, and they were its willing cargo sailing toward destinations that defied geography. Thaddeus had stopped leaving the apartment entirely. His trips to Kerner's butcher shop were no longer necessary. They had become a self-sustaining ecosystem that needed no outside intervention. He spent his days in deep meditation, his body cross-crossed with healing scars that formed intricate patterns across his skin. Sometimes Jeremiah caught him speaking to the walls in languages that predated human speech, carrying on conversations with entities that responded in voices like grinding bones. "They've been waiting so long," Thaddeus explained when asked about his midnight dialogues. "Families like us, Papa. Families who discovered the truth. We're not the first and we won't be the last. This building, it collects us, preserves us. We're becoming part of something larger." Constance had transcended speech entirely. She communicated through gestures, through the arrangement of their meals, through subtle changes in the way she carved and seasoned their flesh. Her movements had taken on the precision of liturgical dance, each cut of the knife following patterns that seemed to be choreographed by forces beyond her conscious control. The outside world had forgotten them entirely. Jeremiah realized this when he tried to remember the last time they had heard footsteps in the hallway, voices from neighboring apartments, or even the sounds of street traffic from below. The building existed now in a pocket of reality that operated by different laws, different physics, different moral imperatives. Mrs. Kowalski from the apartment next door had stopped arguing with her husband. The crying babies had fallen silent. The consumptive coughing that had once echoed through the halls like a tubercular symphony had faded to nothing. When Jeremiah pressed his ear to the walls, he heard only the deep, rhythmic breathing of the building itself, as if their home had developed lungs and was slowly drawing the life from everything within its walls. He tried to leave once, driven by some last vestige of the man he had been before the hunger claimed him. But when he reached the door, his hand passed through the handle as if it were made of smoke. The door itself seemed to shift and waver, becoming insubstantial whenever he approached it with any intention other than returning to the table where his family waited with their offerings of self. "We can't leave," Temperance explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. "We're part of the feast now, Papa. We're both the meal and the diners, the sacrifice, and the altar. Leaving would break the cycle, and the cycle is all that keeps us fed." The truth settled over him like a burial shroud. They were trapped in their own perfection, locked in an eternal loop of consumption and regeneration that would continue until the building itself grew tired of their flavor. They had solved the problem of poverty and hunger, but at the cost of ever experiencing anything else again. Outside their windows, the Lower East Side continued to exist in the world of 1881, where people lived and died according to the ordinary rules of mortality. But inside their apartment, time had become circular, space had become fluid, and the family had become something that could no longer be classified as human. They were relics now, specimens preserved in the amber of their own making, eternal and damned and perfectly, horrifically satisfied. The building breathed around them, content with its harvest, patient in its hunger for more families who would discover the same terrible solution to life's most basic cruelty. In the darkness between the walls, things that had once been people, like the blackwood, stirred and settled, all of them feeding together in the communal feast that had no beginning and would have no end. The hunger had become their salvation and their prison, and they could no longer tell the difference between the two. Spring arrived in 1881 New York with the promise of renewal, but the tenement building on Hester Street remained frozen in perpetual winter. The Blackwood apartment sat empty now to mortal eyes, its windows dark, its doors sealed with the kind of official notices that proclaimed yet another family lost to poverty's relentless appetite. The city records showed 4 deaths from starvation, a.b. tragedy common enough in the Lower East Side to merit only a single paragraph in the Tribune. But the building remembered. In the spaces between its rotting timbers, in the network of pipes that carried more than water, in the foundations that reached deeper into the earth than any blueprint had ever recorded, the essence of the Blackwood family lingered like smoke from an extinguished candle. Their hunger had become part of the structure's DNA, woven into its very existence like a genetic memory that could never be erased. The Kowalski family had been the next to discover the apartment's availability. Polish immigrants fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe, they arrived with nothing but hope and the kind of desperate determination that poverty breeds in the human heart. The rent was remarkably affordable, almost suspiciously so, but in their desperation, suspicion was a luxury they could not afford. Within a month, little Anna Kowalski was found gnawing at her fingernails until they bled, claiming they tasted like the pierogi her grandmother used to make back in Krakow. Her father, Stanisław, discovered that certain factory work paid extraordinary wages for tasks that left mysterious wounds on his arms and legs. Her mother, Katarzyna, began adding strands of her own hair to the family's meager soup, stirring it with the mechanical precision of someone following an ancient recipe. After the Kowalskis came the O'Briens from County Cork, then the Rosenbergs from the Russian Pale, then the Lombardos from the sun-baked hills of Sicily. Each family arrived with their own language, their own customs, their own reasons for fleeing to America's promised land. But the building spoke a universal tongue, the language of hunger, and it taught its lessons with patient, inexorable efficiency. The pattern never varied. First came the gradual isolation as neighbors learned to avoid the 4th-floor apartment, sensing something fundamentally wrong without being able to articulate their fears. Then the discovery that poverty's cruelest problems could be solved through the most intimate of sacrifices. Finally, the transformation. Families becoming something more and less than human, trapped in cycles of consumption that transcended the ordinary boundaries of mortality. The building grew stronger with each harvest. Its foundations deepened, its walls thickened, its appetite became more sophisticated. It learned to recognize the particular desperation that made families vulnerable to its influence, the specific combination of love and hunger that could drive parents to feed their children pieces of themselves rather than watch them starve. By winter's end, the tenement had collected 7 families in its supernatural larder. They existed in parallel dimensions within the same physical space, each group believing themselves to be the only inhabitants of their apartment while their predecessors watched from the spaces between seconds, between breaths, between the falling of snowflakes outside windows that showed different seasons to different eyes. Mrs. Chen from the ground floor sometimes heard the sound of multiple families dining simultaneously, the clink of different sets of cutlery, conversations, in languages that spanned continents and centuries, the wet sounds of flesh being carved and consumed with ritualistic precision. But when she pressed her ear to the wall, the sounds would fade, replaced by the ordinary creaking of old wood settling in the cold. The building's hunger was patient, but never satisfied. It had learned that the most exquisite flavor came not from the flesh itself, but from the moment of surrender, that precise instant when love became so desperate that it transformed into something unrecognizable. It fed on the corruption of family bonds, the perversion of parental instincts, the sweet despair of people who had run out of every option except the unthinkable. Detective Murphy from the 4th Precinct had investigated 17 families who had simply vanished from that building over the years. The landlord always produced death certificates, usually citing starvation or disease. But Murphy had learned to recognize the signs of something more sinister. The way witnesses described families becoming increasingly isolated in the weeks before their disappearance. The reports of strange smells, metallic and organic, that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The fact that no bodies were ever found, despite the official cause of death. But Murphy's investigations always reached the same dead end. The families were gone. The paperwork was in order, and the Lower East Side had too many genuine tragedies for him to waste time chasing ghosts and urban legends. The building continued to stand, continued to rent its apartments to desperate families, continued to offer solutions that no decent society could acknowledge. In the space that had once been the Blackwood apartment, where reality bent around, hunger like light around a black star, the original family still gathered for their eternal feast. They welcomed each new group of residents with the warmth of people who understood suffering, who had found the perfect answer to life's cruelest questions. Temperance, ageless now and terrible in her innocence, would greet each new child with the wisdom of someone who had transcended ordinary existence. "Don't be afraid," she would whisper to scared little ones who found themselves gnawing their fingernails until they bled. "We're family now, and families take care of each other." The cycle continued, patient and perfect and completely insane. The building fed, the city forgot, and somewhere in the spaces between what was real and what was necessary, the definition of love was rewritten in letters carved from living flesh. The hunger never ended. It only grew. Subscribe and comment below if this tale of inherited horror has chilled you to the bone. Would you recognize the signs if you found yourself in a similar situation? Let me know what you thought of the Blackwood family's terrible legacy.